Let's bring in Katie Pavlich, townhall.com editor and Fox News contributor. Sean Duffy, former Wisconsin Republican congressman and co-host of The Bottom Line on Fox Business. And Robert Wolf, former economic advisor to President Obama and founder and CEO of 32 Advisors and a Fox News contributor. He was with President Biden, by the way, last night. I think that's a good place to start, Robert, with you, because there has been a lot of talk about this. It's not just the documents and this report coming out that says, Biden's memory is shot and then he can't really remember a lot of things, including when he left the White House as vice president. Your time with him last night, how did he seem?
He was great last night. He spoke about 45 minutes about democracy being on the line, spoke a lot about Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel and the need to pass the foreign policy dollars and cents that just got past 67 to, I think, 32. He spoke about why this election is critically important. And I should just mention one thing on the document case. I'm proud that President Biden didn't use executive privilege at all with the Trump-appointed special prosecutor. Think about whether President Trump would ever go down that path of not using executive privilege when he says he has full immunity on everything. So if you ask me, there's a quite difference here.
But Katie Pavlich, I mean, that's kind of exactly the point that Jonathan Turley was trying to bring up, is that you have Joe Biden, as Robert is saying there, no, he was sharp last night. He was right on top. It was all perfect, right? And then you have the special counsel saying he can't remember when he left the White House. He can't remember anything. A jury would never convict him because he's an old man with a bad memory. And now he's trying to pivot to say, well, no charges there because I got a bad memory. But man, am I going to make a great president at the age of 82.
Well, first, I think a lot of people will be surprised to know that just having a bad memory gives you an excuse to willfully detain classified information when you were leaving the U.S. Senate or when you're leaving the vice presidency. In both positions, you did not have declassification authority, and yet here we are with this report. It's 388 pages long. There's a lot in here. There may not be charges for President Joe Biden, but this certainly is an indictment on his mental state, given what is in black and white in this report. And it comes at a horrible time for the White House when just today, Karine Jean-Pierre has gone from telling Peter Doocy she's not going to go down rabbit holes, talking about why President Biden is talking to dead people earlier in the week and also last night at a fundraiser, to today, the special counsel who's been investigating this, who did these interviews with the president behind closed doors without all the pressures of the cameras and people asking questions. And they're saying he's too old to answer basic questions about classified information, which brings up questions about how he will lead the country politically. And also there's, of course, the accusations that the Biden campaign has lodged against the Trump campaign and President Trump and his classified documents case, and the national security implications here when it comes to foreign policy and being the commander in chief.
Yeah, and Sean Duffy, it gets even worse than that because Katie mentioned that Karine Jean-Pierre was talking about, well, there was this and this, but she was asked specifically about, the president talking about someone who's been dead for the better part of 3 decades. And she spun, and it was all now about January 6th. This was about January 6th, she said. It had something, she's thinking, where is she going with this? That had nothing at all to do with January 6th. So now you have the White House spokesperson saying, no. It was about January 6th, not really about his memory. He was trying to make this point. What?
Exactly. So she's trying to be cute. She's trying to be creative. She's probably proud of herself that she was able to bring the question back to January 6th. But the American voter sees that and knows that Joe Biden is talking about world leaders that have been dead for some time. And they, again, agree with Robert Hur. He's a senile old man. But Robert Wolf, what he saw last night is not what the American people see every day when they see Joe Biden on television. I also think it's interesting. Having these documents is kind of like running a red light. Either you did it or you didn't do it. There's not a whole lot of argument around it. And Joe Biden seemed to have pretty good mental status when he was a U.S. Senator and took those documents out of a SCIF, which, by the way, I was in Congress. It's nearly impossible to get documents out of the SCIF in Congress. But also when he left the vice presidency, he seemed to be fairly cognitively sharp. And at that time, he took the documents out. So, yes, he might not be able to remember today, but you don't need his memory. You have the documents. He took them when he was in office. So I don't care what Joe Biden says. I have a smoking gun in the picture you have up there on the screen right now that he took the documents. He should have been prosecuted just like Trump, or neither of them should have been prosecuted.
I just want to read a little bit, if I can, Robert, before I get to you, on page 208. And it says here, in his interview with our office, Mr. Biden's memory was worse. He did not remember when he was vice president, forgetting on the first day of the interview when his term ended. If it was 2013, when did I stop being vice president, was the question. And forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began in 2009. Am I still vice president? He did not remember even within several years when his son Beau died, and his memory appeared hazy when describing the Afghanistan debate that was once so important to him. Other things he mistakenly said he had, quote, had a real difference of opinion with General Carl Eikenberry, when in fact Eikenberry was an ally whom Mr. Biden cited approvingly in his Thanksgiving memo to President Obama. And so, Robert, you say he was sharp as a tack. This report brings up, I mean, there are more than just 6 or 7 different examples of him not remembering. And just to this week, as Sean's point was, you know, he's not doing a Super Bowl interview. He's not giving press conferences. The former president sat in front of the cameras today and gave an entire news conference on what he thinks the Supreme Court decision is going to mean for him. And we haven't heard from Joe Biden in quite some time. So it's hard to make, or for the country to believe the argument that he's sharp as a tack. And when you read this and you hear some of the current statements and the absolute fact that he's not going to go before the country and answer a few questions from CBS, which is not going to exactly throw him Nolan Ryan curveballs.
Well, a lot to unpack there. I'm glad you're only referencing 6 or 7 paragraphs out of 300 plus pages, so I would give him a pretty good grade for that. Let me just be clear. I care about what he's done as president legislatively, and I care what he's done from a foreign policy perspective. I'm glad we passed the money for the Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel today. I hope the House does their job. We passed infrastructure bill, bipartisan. President Trump was talking about infrastructure week for 4 straight years and never passed it. I think we should spend time on looking at our successes, okay, as opposed to when he, you know, slipped on a bit of a confusion on a 45-minute speech when everyone does that. I'm not going to get into whatsaboutism, but we all know what I'm talking about.
Okay, Katie Pavlich, to you, because it just seems to me like there is mounting evidence that maybe some people, when they have these polls that show, you know, 23% of the voters think that he has the ability to become president or be president again because of his mental acuity.
Well, Trace, you mentioned the lack of access to the president. So on Tuesday, he said that he was going to talk to reporters today, Thursday afternoon, that he would answer their questions. Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, had to walk that back. Let's not forget the White House and members of the Judiciary Committee leadership on Capitol Hill have had this report for probably a couple of days now, at least 24 hours. So they probably knew this was coming. Now President Joe Biden will land back on the South Lawn, and he will be shouted questions from reporters instead of asking, answering them from the podium in the briefing room, for example. So they're not allowing the American people to get answers on the issues that he supposedly wants to talk about outside of this report. And it also goes back to the issues that he's been facing over the past 3 years with the scandals that have been piling up, including his partnership and affiliation with Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden stayed in the Wilmington, Delaware house during COVID. That's where he was in lockdown. He had access to that garage. There's photos of him driving the Corvette with the boxes in the background with people, strangers in the car who don't have background checks, who don't have security clearances. So this opens up a whole another issue for the White House, and they've tried to avoid talking about that. And there's big questions about why he wanted to keep the classified information. What was the purpose of that, especially given that Hunter Biden had so much access to it, and he was working with people around the world who do not like the United States of America and do not have the best interests of this country in mind. It seems like he should be more responsible as president than that.
Katie makes a good point. I mean, his son had a substance abuse problem, had access to that house, had access to the garage. Sean Duffy, to you, we've got to go, but I want to get your final thoughts on this because, you know, it's not just the Francois Mitterrand thing. It goes deeper than that. We have this every single week. There are we have the videotape. We could play it for a long time on some of the president's gaffes and so forth. And I just wanted you to wrap us up on this.
Yeah, so Hunter Biden, again, has ties to the CCP. A picture's worth 1,000 1,000 words, Trace. Look at the box. You have it on your screen right now. That's not a crisp box that has been sitting in the garage for, 6 years, 8 years. It looks like someone's been rifling through it. Someone's been using that box, probably looking at files. Was it Hunter Biden? What information was in the box, and what information did Hunter have access to? Also, the Penn Biden Center, where information was found, also received donations from companies that are Chinese, but also have ties to the CCP. All of this reeks to high heaven, and I think, again, we can judge her, and now we'll judge Joe Biden on the stage in the campaign, but this is no doubt going to be part of a system that the American people look at that appears to be two-tier. Joe Biden with these boxes in his house, Donald Trump raided at 6 o'clock in the morning with black SUVs and charged a completely two-tier system. Yeah,
Sean Duffy, Robert Wolf, Katie Pavlich, thank you all.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.